Scott, you mentioned that you're a finance nerd, and I'm curious how, since it's very applicable right now, um, is the current economic conditions, how badly is this going to affect the fire community? I've had a complaint or a criticism of the fire community with the dogma of the 4% rule and how that doesn't really account for large variations, unexpected variations like
sequence of return risk,
like would be in this book right here, the Black Swan.
There you go. Yeah.
Hey, to be fair, you shared the video yesterday that this is not a Black Swan event and it was foreseeable. So I'm just going to throw that out there and mess up.
It's not a Black Swan event, but this particular one isn't a Black Swan event. But my complaint with my criticism of the dogma of the fire community has been the 4% rule as a rule, and not as and a lot of they have the same problem that real estate investors have, is that many of them have only been successful since the crash. And so they have literally the turkey problem. They are misassessing the amount of risk because they haven't been exposed to it. So I say all that to say is, like, how do you think this is going to take a disproportionate hit to the fire community?
Yeah. So I'll back up 1 second here. When I want to retire early, right, I need to amass a certain amount of wealth such that I can draw down in that portfolio indefinitely without running out of money. Right. So how much of that wealth can I draw down? Well, a bunch of smart people got together and they said, hey, if I have a portfolio of 50% bonds and 50% stocks, what is the safe withdrawal rate? How much can I withdraw each year from that portfolio without depleting my entire reserve over a 30-year period? Right. And that's where the 4% rule derives from. It's a study called the Trinity study, prior work from William Bengen. Right, I'm probably butchering his name. Right, I've only read it, but like these folks to study that, and when you look at how much you can withdraw, you can't like say, hey, my returns, my average return over the last 30 years has been 8%. Therefore, I can withdraw 8%, and I'm going to be fine. Right, you have to use a number that's much lower than the average return to avoid depleting your portfolio, to take into account this phenomenon called sequence of returns risk, right? It's a big fancy word for saying what happens if my portfolio drops immediately after I retire and I have to begin withdrawing from a smaller base right after that, right? Well, the entire point of the exercise of back testing portfolios over every time period available in modern history, right, is to determine that number. And so the 4% rule absolutely takes into account for precisely the event that we're encountering right now. It takes into account sequence of returns risk. So that's number one. Number two, the next problem you have with the 4% rule is, hey, after 30 years, the 4% rule is only looking at, do I run out of money entirely? Right? But if you're in your 30s or 40s and you're retiring, you don't want to be left, starting with $1 million and left with $100,000 at the end of that 30-year period, right? So there's 2 subpoints that combat that, right? The first of which is the difference between 30 years in financial planning and infinity is not very large, just because of the way the math works, right? If you were to take a mortgage, for example, and you extend that payment, go from a 30-year to a 1,000-year mortgage, your payment doesn't really decrease by that much. It's almost exactly the same because you're paying almost all interest in the first series of payments anyways, right? So that's number one. So, but yes, infinity is different than 30 years. So you do have a small number of cases where the 4% rule may not work for folks in a longer time period, right? And so from that, you go back and you say, hey, well, the 4% rule assumes that you have no cash reserve. It assumes you have no other assets or income stream. It assumes that you spend like a robot no matter what at 4% of your portfolio each year, right? It makes all these absurd assumptions that if you're a practical, reasonable human being, you're going to be able to easily avoid. So one more second here. I'm almost done on my rant because I love and hate this question because it shows the ignorance of this field. So all of that aside, the 4% rule is a perfectly appropriate rule of thumb that is not going away and is immensely conservative and designed for exactly the situation that we're in. But even still, nobody I know, I have never met in all the people I've interviewed, all the people I've talked to, all the time I've spent in this as part of this movement, I've never met a person who is retired with just their assets at the 4% rule, with a 50-50 stock bond portfolio, no cash, and no other streams of income. Every single person has an ace in the hole. They have an extra set of income. They have a big cash buffer, or they're far more conservative than the 4% rule. So how's my answer to that?
I can tell that's the first time you've ever gotten any
Yeah.
question like that. Just
That's
totally
right.
off the fly answer.
Yeah.